Hi everyone. This is the webinar for TCRP Report 194, Knowledge Management Resource to Support Strategic Workforce Development for Transit Agencies. On behalf of the National Transit Institute, I welcome you and thank you all for participating. The National Transit Institute develops, promotes, and delivers training and education programs for the public transit industry in the United States. Today we are pleased to have as our presenters Dr. Candace Cronin and Dr. Allison Alexander, both from ICF. Today's webinar consists of Candace and Allison presenting their material, followed by a question and answer session at the end. You can participate in the discussion by using the chat pod that is located in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. I will be monitoring the chat during the presentation and will be saving your questions so they will all be addressed at the end. I will ask them to the presenters and they will answer. If you've not printed out a copy of the presentation that was emailed to you, you can either download it from the handout section up at the top left, or you can copy and paste the two links in the notes section, and that should give you the handouts as well. I know some people have problems with downloading things from Google Drive. The link directly below that should probably work better if that's an issue you have. I guess without any further ado then, I will turn the presentation over to Candace.
Thank you, Lori, and thank you for everyone that's on the call, and I'm really excited to be here today. We're very proud of this work on knowledge management and have enjoyed working on a number of TCRP and ACRP reports. Just as a brief introduction, so again, my name is Candace Cronin, and I was principal investigator for this project. And I've been doing this management consulting work for about 19 years. And Allison Alexander is also on the call. She really was kind of our day-to-day project manager, and is going to walk us through the detailed methodology in a moment, just so that you can see how we arrived at some of these knowledge management solutions that you'll see in the guidebook. But we are going to give you high-level overview of what's in the guidebook, the content, and some of the key highlights and some of the exciting things, but we're hoping that really this spurs you to want to pick up that guidebook and start using it. It's a very much a practical resource and something that we feel like the transit industry desperately needs. So also want to just kind of give recognition to our partners here. Our subcontractor was BCG Transportation Group, wonderful folks there, and I know Reem Lazaro is on the call. Because of being muted, you're not going to be able to hear him right now, but thank you, Reem, for being on as well. And just going back to Allison and I, our background, we are industrial organizational psychologists, and we've done management consulting for quite some time and really focus on workforce development, leadership development, employee engagement, and really helping organizations sustain themselves and build workforce capacity. And certainly knowledge management is a critical element of that. So, but I'd also direct you to look at other TCRP reports that we've published. TCRP Report 139, where we look at, we focus on transit management. There's some great templates in there for job descriptions for transit manager jobs that you could put to use. Also, Report 162, where we focus on recruitment, retention, training and development, and professional capacity building for the industry. So certainly, look to those reports as well. And really, one of the things that's unique about Allison and I's background is that we both work across multiple industries. So we've worked across defense, military, education, you name it. We've pretty much worked in all of those major industries. So let me make sure I'm moving the slides here, Lori. I think not moving forward. Let's see. So sorry, folks, you're not seeing this slide that has all the information that I'm reading to you. Allison, do you want to move forward here? There we go. Great. Okay. So this is our slide.
It wasn't moving when you clicked the arrow?
No, it wasn't.
It wasn't moving?
Yeah, I think we're okay now. It seems to now. So
okay,
it may have just gotten stuck on my end. Okay. Okay. And again, I mentioned BCG, and I would just say we don't have their pictures on here. Sorry, Reem, but I do want to point out that they really were instrumental in doing this work, and many of you probably know them because they've worked with individual transit organizations, and they truly are transit experts. So we feel like the combination of our expertise is that, Allison and I and ICF really bring to the table that knowledge of best practices in workforce development, human resource consulting, and leadership development, and those areas, as well as KM, knowledge management, across industries. And so that's one of the unique things. And then Reem's team really brings the transit expertise. Okay, I just want to say two special thanks. Oh, good, my button's working now. To our oversight panel. This is a very engaged panel, and we got excellent feedback from them along the way. So we really enjoyed working with all of these folks, and also our senior program officer, Diane Schwager, as well. Thank you, Diane. Great. Well, now I'm going to turn it over to Allison to really talk us through the methodology. Allison, if you can kind of give us some highlights, and then I will jump back in to talk about some of the strategies that we identified.
Great, thanks. So we wanted to start with just a high-level overview of what we did during this project so you can see where all of the information came from and just understand how the final guidebook came together. As an overview of the project, the goal of this project was really to help transit agencies understand what KM is, what knowledge management is, why it's important, and to give those tools and resources that can help you to bring knowledge management to your agencies and be successful in gathering, storing, and transferring that knowledge among your employees. As for the outcomes of the project, we created a guidebook that's available as the TCRP Report 194, and that has detailed action plans and strategies that you can use to bring knowledge management to your agency. It also has a catalog of tools that can be used as resources, and we'll talk about those a little later in the presentation, but that catalog is presented in the appendix of the report, so it's all in that one document that you can get from the TRB website. And then I'll move on to the next slide here. To conduct this project, we took an approach, a multi-pronged approach, we call it, to gather data in different ways, to bring together information and make sure that we're able to provide high-quality information that's up-to-date and based in facts and research. So the project started out with a literature review, and the purpose of that really to gather the best practices and focus on the science behind knowledge management. So literature review included academic journals, different published reports, technical manuals available that organizations have published, and any other written resources that could really provide that background information and best practices around knowledge management and what knowledge management is. And then we use this information from the literature review as kind of the background knowledge for the rest of the report to make sure that we're grounded in current knowledge and best practices. The next task in the project was to conduct an environmental scan. And what this really means is that we wanted to see what knowledge management looks like both in transit as well as in organizations that are considered leaders in the area. So those that are implementing KM strategies well and seeing success in their implementation. So we conducted focus groups and interviews with transit agency leaders as well as others who implement knowledge management both within and outside of transit. For example, we talked to individuals in government organizations, people across different industries, publicly traded companies, to really get a broad view of how knowledge management is working and being effective. In all, we talked to over 50 individuals to gather that information about knowledge management, how it's used, and the challenges and successes that people have experienced in utilizing the knowledge management strategies. We also looked into different knowledge management tools and resources that are available publicly that organizations could use to support knowledge management efforts. And then once we had those initial drafts, pulling together all of that information, we conducted brief case studies with transit agencies. The purpose of that was to see how these different strategies that we see in other industries or in the literature, how they could be effective in transit agencies and present that information to you all as examples of what can be done and how to use knowledge management. And then we created those final research that we're talking about today and that can be downloaded from the TRB website. So next I want to move on to just an overview of knowledge management and the report and really get into the meat of the project. So we like to start with what is knowledge management. It's important to know what we're talking about so we can understand why it's valuable and why, as transit agency leaders, these are things that you want to bring to your agencies. So knowledge management is a process used to collect and manage organizational knowledge and information. So it's a way to make sure you're not losing that knowledge that employees hold before they leave, and to make sure that things can be done consistently and effectively, and the knowledge of the organization can stay there. So CAM is valuable for a lot of different reasons. I know that we can't see you, so we can't see a show of hands, but virtually think about, how many of you have senior leaders who are going to be retiring in the next 5 years? Or have people who have been with your agencies for a long time who are working in maintenance or scheduling, doing important things for your agency work. A lot of you have your hands virtually raised and can relate to that situation. And that's one of the reasons that knowledge management is really important. It makes sure that you are not losing that knowledge that you have, and that you can continue to operate effectively with changes as time goes on. So we have a couple of just overarching strategies or reasons here that knowledge management is important. So first of all, an effective risk management strategy. And this is really, if you think about preparing for those retirements or turnover, like I mentioned, making sure that you have that knowledge and you can keep it. Keeping your institutional knowledge up to date and correct is another value of knowledge management and utilizing it. It also enables business success. So when you're able to build employee knowledge and skills and have them share that knowledge, they're able to use knowledge across programs or across different areas of the agency to be able to reduce errors, to be effective, to make correct decisions based on your knowledge. It also enables faster decision making. So when you have knowledge documented and shared, more than one person knows what's going on and knows what's needed. So you can make those decisions faster. And it also increases work efficiency. So by focusing on knowledge management, you can break down silos that we know exist in organizations sometimes. You can have people share best practices with one another. By focusing on these different knowledge management strategies, you can see all of these different benefits within your own organization. And then here, this is really a roadmap to everything that's included in the guidebook. So this is, we call it what is involved in KM, but it's the different parts of KM that come together to create a robust knowledge management program. So the first part that we'll be talking about today is knowledge management culture. And this is really just creating an organization in which people know that knowledge management is important, that it's valued, and that they'll be rewarded for contributing to sharing the knowledge with others. The next area that we'll be talking about today is knowledge management planning. And this is really the types of strategies that you can put in place to make sure that your knowledge management will be successful. So what you need to think about in terms of setting up a knowledge management program within your agency. And then the next three are different elements of knowledge management. So knowledge capture, that's exactly what it sounds like. It's gathering that information from your employees and making sure that you can incorporate it into the shared institutional knowledge. So make sure it's gathered and not just in those employees' brains. The next area is knowledge retention, and that's making sure you can keep that knowledge, that everything your employees share that contributes to the institutional knowledge is kept with the agency as they leave. And then finally, knowledge transfer, and that's just making sure that the sharing is happening, not just that it's kept in a repository somewhere or that, it's written down, but that people actually share the knowledge and they're able to work with each other to learn from one another. So here, excuse me, this is an example of what the different strategies in the guidebook look like. So the guidebook has strategies for each of those 5 different categories that were in the last slide. And the purpose of those strategies is to give specific ways you can bring knowledge management to your agencies. And for each of the 14 strategies we have a detailed action plan that looks like the one in this picture. And it's with a summary just to give an overview of what that strategy is and what it looks like in an organization. Next, there's a rationale for implementing the strategy. That gives a business case for why the strategy is important or how it can help you. You know, if you're trying to show your board that a strategy would be good to implement or get buy-in from senior leaders to implement a knowledge management strategy, there's information provided there that can help with that. We also just quick hitting highlights about the action plan, and then we go into factors about implementation. So we talk about who needs to be involved in implementation. What does the timeline look like? You know, how long will it take to get this type of strategy up and running? There are some examples of resources that would be helpful in implementing the strategy. So it could be different technologies, different types of documents, anything that will be valuable to you as a person implementing these different knowledge management strategies. We provide some examples of effective programs using that strategy. And again, that's so you can see how it works in real life, not just a written list of to-dos, but how organizations and transit agencies are actually using these strategies to bring knowledge management to their organizations. We provide the impact of the strategies, so the value that they can bring or how they can create positive outcomes, as well as some cautionary considerations. So those might be things to look out for, you know, challenges that other agencies have encountered in these strategies. And then there's a little information on a communication plan, so how to share the information and the types of information to share. And we lay this out in the same format for all of the strategies, so you can see as you look through the different strategies, the same information is presented, and you can understand how, you know, different action plans might be different or have a different impact for your specific agency. In addition to these action plans, I mentioned in the methodology slide that we conducted case studies with transit agencies. So we have a chapter in the guidebook that presents those case studies. And what it lays out is how different transit agencies that are small, mid-size, and large are using these knowledge management strategies in their operations. So we give some demographic information about the agency so you can understand what they look like in the situation they're operating in. And then we lay out how knowledge management has been used within their agency. So if they focus on knowledge capture or creating a culture that's important for that supports knowledge management. We also talk about who they have involved and what the steps they took to successfully implement those strategies are. And the goal here, again, is that you can see that these strategies can work in transit, that they are things that you're able to implement and able to use. And like I said, those are presented for small, mid-sized, and large transit agencies. So you can see a variety of ways that these different strategies have been implemented and used. And then the guidebook wraps up with a chapter called Closing the Loop. And this is just guidance that you can use to implement knowledge management as a larger program, not just focusing on the individual strategies you might use or, you know, the step-by-step process you might take to bring about a mentoring program, but really how you can tie everything in this guidebook together and create an agency-wide knowledge management program that really focuses on knowledge management as a whole across the agency and something that is sustainable. And this chapter provides a lot of how-to guidance, you know, specific instructions like how to do this step or how to get your buy-in or how to plan for an overall strategy for your agency. So that is a really helpful kind of step-by-step, what can you do to really focus on knowledge management. And the next thing we'll be doing in this webinar is to really dig into those strategies provided in the guidebook. So we wanted to start here with a list of all of the action plans that are included. You can see there are action plans for each of those categories that I talked about. So we'll first talk about the action plans talking about the KM culture, and then we'll talk about ones for planning, capture, retention, and sharing. And this is just provided again as a list here so you can kind of see where we're going and the different types of strategies that are provided. And with that, I will pass it off to Candace to talk about knowledge management culture.
Great. Thank you, Allison. And I hope everyone got at least a little preview there of some of the neat way that not only is this rich content within the guidebook, but you also saw how it was organized. So we tried to make it very user-friendly. So we definitely encourage you to take a look at that guidebook. And the neat thing is we tried to build out each chapter so that you could easily extract the information you need. So I feel like that's a real strength here, and Allison was instrumental in doing that. So now we're going to talk about kind of the different components of knowledge management, the different pieces that are important to have in place. And I think this one, when we talk about culture, I tend to see this as the foundational piece. You could try to implement all sorts of flashy and savvy initiatives and things that are really trendy, but if your culture, if your organization is not really supporting it and doesn't see the value of it, those kinds of things are really going to fall flat on their face, and that's what we've seen. And I hate to say that so crudely, but that's the best way to think about it. So I think one thing that we'll just talk about here on this slide is really, kind of what do we mean by building a culture? And again, the culture, a knowledge management culture, is one that really encourages a positive environment that's supportive of knowledge management, so where people are encouraged to share their value seen and sharing the knowledge that we have as opposed to holding it onto it ourselves. And it's something that it creates a fluidity. So when you have a culture that's supportive of knowledge management, you see that it's just kind of part of everyone's day-to-day job to constantly be sharing and updating repositories and sharing and insights with colleagues. So that's really, kind of the observed behavior that you would see with the culture that's supportive. In terms of the big challenges, I think a lot of this, when we think about formal structures, we think about transit systems are frequently very siloed and hierarchical, so we tend to kind of focus on our one area that we're trying to work in, and a lot of times are not communicating across the organization. So it's not just within a particular division that knowledge management is so important, but it's also across areas. That's how we build professional capacity and an understanding of the bigger picture of the organization. So I don't know that we talk about this explicitly, Allison, but I do, one thing I would say is that the more that we share knowledge about across the organization, the more that all of our employees will have a greater understanding of not only, what is the mission of the organization, but also how do I fit into it, and then where do I go to help, improve upon something, so as opposed to reinventing the wheel. So I think, again, another part of having a knowledge management culture, and it's really about seeing the value of knowledge management. Okay, so let's get into some of the specific action plans that we had. So each section has a series of action plans. This particular one on culture has 3 action plans, and the first one is talking about top-level support. I would probably challenge anybody, well, not me personally, but the research would challenge anyone that says that management support is not essential to driving change. Anytime you're trying to change the culture, the support has to start at the top. This does not mean that we should ignore our mid or frontline staff. As you'll see, that's kind of the second action plan, but really the first place to start is with top-level support. And part of that is making sure that CAM is what I would call, I like to think of the word integrated within the organization, not just something that's housed within HR. It's not just something that HR does or our IT folks do when they build a database for us. This is something that permeates the entire organization. And we also kind of, in doing this, so knowledge management needs to be part of the strategic priorities of the organization. So when we're doing strategic planning, we need to be thinking about, where knowledge management fits into that. And then also, in order to get that leadership buy-in, it's important to have that cost-benefit analysis. Leaders want to know exactly, the executive team wants to know, okay, what is going to be required for me to invest in this? What are the costs of doing different initiatives? Like if we're trying to do something like a new repository, or we're trying to do something bigger like a community of practice where we bring people together to talk about, on a daily or weekly basis, and they share some of their insights. What is that going to cost this organization, and what's the return for us? And I think this is also important that leader support then has to translate into employee support. So obviously we can't stop there. We need employees to have a voice in this. We need to kind of remove that us versus them mentality, so it's not so ultimately part of leaders driving the change is also leaders engaging employees and hearing from them about areas in which knowledge management could be valuable. And this brings us to the second action plan, which really is, the first thing when you start anything new, one of the first things you're going to hear from employees is that they're probably already strapped for time. Their daily work experiences, they really need to see how these knowledge management strategies improve their daily work experiences, because ultimately, the first thing we think about is the administrative burdens of adopting and doing something new. And so again, it has to be one of those things where we focus in on the benefits, and we try to make knowledge management become a routine and seamless thing. One of the things I always tell folks is that, or tell organizations, is that any time you implement something new, certainly there's a little bit of a trudging that goes along, a little bit of extra time that it takes to get things moving. But ideally, if you implement knowledge management in some of the ways that we outline here in the guidebook, you'll see that over time you build efficiencies, right? So you need to build in that time for the additional questions, the additional challenges that are going to be faced, and that things might slow down a little bit before they pick up. And if you're implementing this as a seamless practice within the organization, then you should build those efficiencies that I just mentioned. The other thing here with this second action plan is really about feedback loops. So employees, instead of just throwing something at your employees and saying, here, you need to start doing this knowledge management approach, this is what we're doing, it's really important to gain information from the employees and to say, how is this, what are some areas, again, that you would like to see improved, that you think sharing knowledge could be beneficial and help improve your work? What are some things that you see as potential challenges and that are going to kind of get in the way of how you do work? How can we overcome those? Anytime we can strategize with our employees in the room, you're going to get a lot more buy-in and support. And then incentivizing employees so that they feel like there's a value and reward to knowledge management. I mean, sometimes we even talk about incorporating this into, kind of a performance review model where it's, if you're doing annual performance reviews, then you're also assessing employees and even leaders on how well they're engaging in knowledge management. So also another piece of this is really, this is kind of the global piece, I guess, identifying cultural inhibitors. So again, a lot of transit agencies, we tend to have a, and I know this is, the number one argument is it's a time issue, but we tend to have what I would call a push versus a pull mentality. So a push mentality is we tend to kind of just try to shove through something and be more reactive, and let's not address it unless it's broken, and then if it is broken, we'll hurry up and fix it, and we don't look at the bigger picture of what can we learn from that? What can we take away? What are our lessons learned? And how can we pull insights in advance of a problem coming up, right? So that's where I'm encouraging us to think, how can we have more of a pull mentality? How can we start brainstorming in advance of something happening to identify innovative ways to gather insights and to constantly be sort of improving ourselves as, as transit agencies. So, and again, change management is an important part of this, using the communication strategies that are integral to change management. A key piece of this is obviously communicating about why KM matters. And I think some of the biggest cultural barriers we heard about are getting over that sort of coveting of knowledge that some of us tend to do, or those fears that we have that we're going to be replaced or become dispensable. We've worked with organizations like NASA who are doing knowledge management really well. At least at the headquarters level, I can speak for that, and I can tell you that, the thing is, employees don't really seem threatened by sharing their knowledge, and they're not replaced, because what happens in that whole process is you start to see the capacity that some individuals have, and you see where their strengths are, and they're also able to openly share, okay, but this is a weak area for me, and someone else can plug in there. And so there becomes this interdependency that's achieved when we establish an effective knowledge management culture. Okay, and these are some of the case studies that we heard. So what we did is we, I just want to be clear here that really we did not identify any transit agencies that were implementing robust knowledge management programs, but we identified some things that they were doing, initiatives that spoke to knowledge management. So again, this is where, as Allison mentioned, we pulled from other industries too, but we also thought it was important, as you'll see on this slide, to feature what are some things that some transit industries are doing. Even if they don't have a comprehensive knowledge management approach, there are some things that are being done that do support knowledge management and do encourage that. And I think In terms of this building top-level support, we heard a large transit agency talk about a charter document they use that outlines new initiatives before they go to leadership. So let's say a human resource team gets together and they develop this charter document, and it outlines exactly why they want to implement this new approach and what the value of it is, and what level of involvement is expected of leadership. So that's really important. For smaller transit agencies, we even heard about engaging the board of directors and making sure that they support and buy into the benefits of KM. So that's a really important piece about getting top-level support. In terms of frontline support, we talked about one transit organization talked about creating these collaborative online operational manuals where people can actively go in and update them. And I think this is really probably more for what we call explicit knowledge. That's kind of the how-to knowledge. But that's certainly just as important as the tacit knowledge. And I don't know that, tacit knowledge is sort of understanding, the context. So, for example, we talk about just a simple example would be riding a bike. I could give you the information. I could say hold the handlebars. I could tell you all the components of a bike, but there's some contextual information or knowledge that can be harder to translate, and that's really tacit knowledge. But this particular example really is talking about explicit, which is, again, equally important to capture. So sometimes organizations like to start with figuring out ways to exchange and promote management of explicit knowledge, because that's kind of the sort of what I would call the easier type of knowledge to identify and to manage, and then move into what we call the tacit knowledge, which is kind of the the understanding of the context. So again, equally important. Identify cultural barriers. So again, this larger transit agency talked about conducting cultural assessments to identify where it is they need to improve. So again, doing a knowledge management assessment and seeing where is it that we are stovepiping, where is it that we're not sharing openly, and encouraging, that not only capture, and we'll get into the other pieces, but not only sharing the knowledge, but codifying it and transferring it and all the other elements and retaining that knowledge. Where is it that we're perhaps suffering and need to work through? Let's see. Okay, and then we're going to talk about knowledge planning. So planning, again, we all know strategic planning is critical. We think about how are we going to plan for our scheduling, how, we have route changes, how is that going to, route changes, how is that going to play out? And so that is obviously a key piece in our day-to-day operations of our transit systems, but it's equally important in knowledge management implementation. Okay, here you'll see that knowledge management planning refers to any of the activities required to not only understand the needs of the transit agency, but also determine how knowledge management can fit into perhaps existing processes and procedures to bring benefits. So again, we're not talking about some radical transformation of your agency. I mean, certainly that's something that you may be considering. But again, we would propose that there are ways that knowledge management can start to permeate and become an important part of your organization and your value system and your day-to-day operations without a major overhaul to what you're doing. So, again, that's kind of what we're encouraging in this throughout the guidebook. Some of the obstacles you can see listed here, again, I mentioned the extra work may be required. That's the one that everybody sort of balks at and gets nervous about. And I think, again, initially, anytime you implement any kind of change, there's the extra work, but we can build efficiencies over time. So we really have to look big picture here. And again, gathering tacit knowledge, I mentioned tacit knowledge a minute ago, and it's understanding the contextual knowledge that people have, and sometimes that can be rather difficult to grab onto. And so again, that's where, and we'll talk more specifically about strategies around this in a minute, but anytime someone's trying to understand what somebody else does on the job, sometimes being able to observe that, being able to participate in that activity with them helps to convey that type of contextual knowledge that's so critical. Let's go to some of the chapter highlights. So again, for this planning chapter, there were 4 action plans. The first one is really looking at taking an inventory of what are we already doing that potentially can support KM. So a lot of times there are all these different facets of initiatives that we might have going on within our agency to help develop our workforce, or to help training, or to help improve upon a particular operation. or a procedure. And a lot of times if we can capture those things and sort of create, and we'll talk about in a minute, creating a mapping. But again, just be able to pull together what are some of the activities that we're already engaging that can support knowledge management, and perhaps we just need to put kind of what I would call a package around this, right? So we may have all these little pieces, but they're kind of in different places within our organization, and they're not really being thought of for the purpose of knowledge management. So again, let's first take that inventory. And so again, this chapter talks about that. And then moving on to the second action plan is where we talk a lot about, and to be clear, let me give you a couple examples before we move on, sorry, with the first action plan. So for example, you may have job descriptions. You may have kind of a reporting structure in place. You may have some software in place, databases that you're using to capture things, policy manuals, standard operating procedures. All of those different elements can help support knowledge management. So again, we want to make sure and leverage those and have those cataloged somewhere so that we're tracking what we're already doing. And then the second action plan is really about preparing prepare knowledge networks to identify knowledge gaps. So again, we're trying to see, where is it that we need to do a better job of accessing the knowledge that's available in our organization. And this is different than business process mapping. So because we're starting with like a single idea and building connections to that topic. So for example, we could ask a question like, how do we provide paratransit services to our customers? And then you start with this and you build out these circles or networks to identify, where, who would have this knowledge, where can we find this knowledge, what are the various connections. So it's kind of like you picture like a spider web, right? We're starting to create these knowledge networks to understand exactly where we go for the type of information we need. And then you can start building kind of a roadmap of who has this institutional knowledge that's so critical. And then that takes us nicely to the third action plan, which is about using business process mapping. So for example, you can imagine that we have these different knowledge networks, and now we're going to start actually leveraging those and moving into actually mapping out some of the organizational processes that we're a part of. So, if you think about the larger processes, and we do process mapping, and we go from, when you go from step 1 to step 2, who are all the individuals you're talking to? Who holds the key information, and how do we obtain that information? And so you can imagine that these networks, this mapping gets rather large, but it can be a very important way to start to identify that we not only know where to find, we're starting to plan ahead to know where to find this information, so that then we can kind of move into what the future phases of capturing, which I'll talk about in just a moment. And then finally, we talk about identifying critical succession planning needs. So again, we need to constantly be thinking about the future. I think there's sometimes we feel so bogged down in the present that it's hard for us to think big picture. But as Allison mentioned a minute ago, many of the transit agencies we talk to have 50% or more of their leadership and executive staff ready to retire in the next 5 years. I mean, that's pretty scary if you think about that juxtaposed next to not having a knowledge management approach or system in place. That can be rather daunting. So I think this is really important. Let me share a couple of case studies that came out here. So one of the case studies that related back to inventorying existing practices, NASA's Chief Knowledge Officer talked about spending several months just reviewing and categorizing existing practices before NASA even started to build out the KM strategy. So again, what is it we're already doing, and how can we package this together and start to look at this as an opportunity to build a more robust KM program? And then the second thing, we talked to a large public company where this was kind of related to preparing those knowledge networks, and they use what's called scoping interviews to learn more about employees' expertise. So, for example, we might talk to someone and sit down with somebody who's in a critical job, mission-critical job, and say, okay, tell us about the different individuals you talked to get X or Y achieved, right? So again, going back to that paratransit example, who is it that you engage with to help to solve these problems, and then get them to kind of create these knowledge maps. Next, we talked to a mid-sized transit agency, and again, they created organizational charts to identify, and they started using their organizational charts to identify where there was retirement risk, and making sure that those were kind of priority areas for knowledge management. So sometimes, this may be, again, we want this to be something integrated and that permeates the organization, but you have to start somewhere. So a lot of times it's planning to figure out which jobs are the most mission critical. Like if we lost this job became vacant tomorrow, we're going to be in serious trouble. Being able to identify that, and then also being able to look at individuals that are retirement eligible and being upfront about that. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment, but I think that goes back to one of the challenges we have to keep in mind is there's this tendency to think, oh my goodness, if I share my knowledge, then I suddenly become replaceable or dispensable. And I think that is an important piece to get over, is that whole culture around trying to covet knowledge, and instead being able to show the bigger picture of the value that's created through knowledge sharing. Here's a couple more case studies. I won't go through all of these just for sake of time, but again, around planning. So I think, this is really valuable. We heard from several larger transit systems who are doing things like, cross-functional process mapping, trying to help employees understand what knowledge needs to be shared and why. And so they're looking at not just the processes that go on within specific divisions, but also what are some of the broader functions that the organization has to perform, and who do you engage along the way. And again, this is all for planning, because this is before we've gotten to the point of actually capturing what knowledge those individuals hold. We're just trying to determine who knows what, basically. And then we look at the critical succession planning needs. The U.S. State Department talked about this. They have a whole group that's dedicated that spends time focusing on knowledge management, and they talked about having these knowledge continuity team meetings to say, okay, let's talk, let's meet every couple of weeks and really figure out what is it we need to do around knowledge sharing and knowledge management, and where is it that we're lacking. So I think that's really important. And then one large transit agency even talked about rotational programs for critical leadership positions, so employees could rotate through those different areas and different departments and have a broader perspective of what's happening within the organization. And again, I mentioned this builds professional capacity to have that broader perspective, and then also sometimes helps individuals see where their own jobs fit into the larger organization. Okay, knowledge capture, and then I'm going to turn it over to Allison. So this will be the last. You'll have to. This will be the last piece from me. Knowledge capture is really, so we've already planned out who has our knowledge, what are the specific processes that have to be performed, where is it that we have these gaps or needs, potential retirements, potential vacancies, which jobs are mission critical. If we lose people in those, or we lose critical knowledge in those areas, where are we really going to be at a deficit? So we've kind of gone through the planning. We've already inventoried, figured out what current initiatives or resources we have that could perhaps support a whole knowledge management approach. And now we need to start gathering that critical knowledge from individuals, right? Identify who has it and gather it, and create this concept of shared institutional knowledge. So again, we don't want it to just be Sue over there knows how to do all the scheduling, and if Sue doesn't show up for work one day, then we're in trouble, and it sinks her, and it brings everything to a screeching halt. We don't want to be in that situation, and I think far too often there's this sense that smaller transit agencies say, well, we're resource constrained, we don't have a knowledge management person, and then you have the larger agencies saying, well, we're so busy trying to keep all the pieces together and keep things operating smoothly that we don't have time to think about this. And I think it's important to, again, keep the bigger picture in mind and thinking long-term about the implication. If you're not capturing that knowledge, then what happens when Sue doesn't show up or Bob doesn't show up for work, right? So again, these are some of the key things that we need to be thinking about. And again, I talked about knowledge. Here we call it knowledge hoarding, knowledge coveting. We've got to get over that concern. And a part of this goes back to that piece, the culture piece we talked about, with showing the benefits and building out a business case and engaging frontline workers to understand what their knowledge needs are. So if we're doing all those other pieces and planning, then that helps us overcome some of the knowledge hoarding. Let me go through a couple of the action plans for the knowledge capture. And again, these are about conducting knowledge interviews to gather critical knowledge. So this is interesting. If we think about, many of our organizations do exit interviews when somebody's leaving. why are we waiting till people leave? Why aren't we focusing on the employees that we think might even stay a while, but we want to at least understand what it is they know, start to document and capture that information and hold on to it, right? So again, this is not, you may target individuals that are retirement eligible, but I would suggest, because you don't want to create I would suggest going broader than that, because you don't want to create the perception that you're already planning for for certain people to leave, because then it's going to, again, it's just going to exacerbate that concern that, hey, you're trying to replace me. So I think it's important here to make sure that we are conducting these knowledge interviews on a pretty regular basis with a broad group of our core workforce. So like if there's specific areas that we want to target, we've already planned out that we're going to prioritize those areas, but we also want to start to make this a regular pattern across the organization. And again, this is something where we talk through, we've got our process maps in place, we know what processes, we know who has the knowledge. Now we can start asking the key questions about that knowledge, and Allison will talk in a minute about how we retain that once we've captured it. The second action plan here is about codifying the knowledge. So we've got it. Now how do we hang on to it? How do we codify it and make it searchable? So again, we need to think about how do we categorize information, and we need to make sure that employees have access to it. So if we have an intranet, or we have a SharePoint site, or we have databases and files, make sure that employees know where to go for that information. And sometimes this may actually be captured. Maybe again, I have it myself. Yes. But I think sometimes you can create a way to show individuals, just kind of even a list to say, okay, if I'm looking for this particular topic, here's where I go to find that information. Have sort of a table, I call it like a table of contents, so to speak, but more of a live table of contents that gets frequently updated, and that could be on your intranet site or your SharePoint site or wherever it is you store your files, and then making sure that everyone has access to them. Again, knowledge is only as valuable as it is accessible. So great, and here's some sample case studies. So we have mid-sized transit agencies. They talked about using knowledge interviews, and again, and in those interviews, they ask about existing procedures. They ask people, if they do have plans for retirement. They talk to them about, recommendations for maintaining operations, and so that's really valuable. And Allison, you were talking to me a little bit yesterday. We were talking about kind of the craft food example. So I'm gonna call on you for a second. But do you have some more specifics on that mask method? I think that would be interesting for folks to hear about.
Yeah, so, excuse me, Craft Foods uses a mask method, which is not just a craft thing, it's a knowledge management method that's used, but it's called the method for analyzing and structuring knowledge. And it's really just a way to work through a kind of intense interview with employees to understand where they think their expertise lies, what type of information they think they can contribute or share, and kind of like the scoping interviews that Candace mentioned earlier, really just capturing their responsibilities from their perspective, but there's a specific method to follow in doing that.
Yes, sorry, Allison, didn't mean to, I know I didn't prepare you there, but I just wanted to have Allison talk a little bit about that since she, I believe, conducted that interview. But I think, the neat thing about this is these are all some of the tools and resources that we have available, not only within the guidebook where we kind of tell you about them and you can go search them, also in the database that we'll talk more about in a moment. But, the other thing, again, is codifying knowledge. So, again, making it searchable, using keywords, words that are familiar, and technical architects talk about the importance of doing this. So a lot of times we think, okay, I'm just going to go create a database and put all this information in there. Or I'm going to go create a file. But again, file naming, searching capacity, being able to easily type something into a search engine is really important. So again, we want to use terms that are pretty familiar, and even creating a glossary to support this is really important. So I talked about either like a table of contents or think of it as a glossary to say, okay, here's a key term. And it'll tell you exactly, if you're trying to find this information, here's the term you can use to search our system and find that, or search our portal. So again, making sure that that can be easily accessed, because if we spend all this time capturing it and then we don't code it correctly, then it sort of becomes invaluable. So, or not valuable, excuse me. Allison, I'm going to turn it over to let you talk a little bit about retention.
Yeah, thanks, Candace. So the next section of the guidebook focuses on knowledge retention. And knowledge retention really focuses on keeping that knowledge that you've gathered. Candace talked about gathering the knowledge. So keeping that knowledge within your organization and making sure that you have systems and storage repositories in place so that that knowledge doesn't leave with your employees, that once you've captured it, you can keep it somewhere. And this is really important to make sure that knowledge isn't lost. If you're going through the effort to gather it and make sure you know what employees know and who knows what, that you can keep that knowledge and have it accessible for the future of the agency and new employees that may come in. When we talk about challenges to knowledge retention, a couple of the ones that come up are upcoming retirements and technology issues. So we've already mentioned multiple times in this call that we know high-level transit agency employees are retiring and eligible for retirement. So it's really important to make sure you're keeping that knowledge before they leave. And then the other big issue here, like I said, is technology issues. And when we talk to transit agencies, we heard, they might not have access to great storage systems or not know what types of technology storage could be used to hold the knowledge that they've gathered. So the catalog that we've mentioned a couple times, we'll talk about later, has some ideas for that. But the goal here is really to figure out what works for your specific organization and how you can keep and store that knowledge that you gather. So in this chapter, we have two separate action plans on retaining that knowledge. And the first is to utilize knowledge repositories that store and promote access to knowledge. So these repositories would be internal databases that contain critical knowledge. And when we think about repositories, it's not enough to just have somewhere where you plop the information down and you never use it again. It's really important to think about how employees can access that and to make sure it's something that's user-friendly and people can get the information out of. It's not just stuck there. So knowledge repositories promote access to existing knowledge, and they need to be easily searchable, easily accessible. And another thing, they have to be able to adapt to a changing workplace. We know, your business is changing, technology changes, the work you do might change somewhat. So the systems you have to store your knowledge need to be able to adapt to those changes. And the benefit behind repositories is that they're a place you can centralize that knowledge and ensure that employees can find it and use it. They also promote consistency in knowledge storing. So if you have a repository, you can tell, when it's been updated, if all of the policies and procedures you have are up to date and accurate in that repository. So it makes a place where you can check in on the knowledge that you have and make sure it's right. The second action plan in this chapter focuses on standard operating procedures, making sure that you maintain updated standard operating procedures to store your critical technical knowledge. And we've talked a little bit about building upon things that you're already doing, and this is one place where you can definitely do that. We know that everyone has those standard operating procedures in place. The key here is to make sure that you're using them to support knowledge management efforts. So using them to provide that technical knowledge to employees, making sure that employees know what's going on and how things need to happen. And the way to make these contribute to knowledge management is to make sure that they're up to date and that employees are contributing to updating them. So employees, as they perform their daily work, they can see if those SOPs are up to date or they need new information to make sure that how things are actually done and the know-how of the employees is incorporated into those documents. Again, these provide an easy way to share information with employees, so you can keep it somewhere that employees know where it is and can access it if they have questions about work that's going on or what needs to be done. Then Again, a couple of examples here. So for that first strategy, the utilizing knowledge repositories, we talked to a mid-sized transit agency that used a SharePoint repository of the different tools and knowledge that they had. So all of their employees knew how to use SharePoint, knew how it was set up, and knew what was available to access there. So all of that information and that knowledge was shared. NASA, so sorry, I talked about NASA and their knowledge management efforts, but they made sure that the way their repository was set up was, first of all, customized to their organization, but also allowed employees to easily search and find the information that they needed. Because if it's too hard for employees to find what they're looking for, they're just going to stop looking. So you want to make sure that that easy searching, quick access is built into any repositories. And then a couple of examples for the maintaining updated standard operating procedures. We talked to a large transit agency that just something as simple as making sure they're updated on a regular schedule to keep those procedures accurate and current, and making sure employees know what that schedule is and where they can find those documents. We also talked to a mid-sized transit agency that talks about involving their employees in updating the standard operating procedures. And this goes back to a lot of what Candace was talking about with the culture and getting employees engaged in knowledge management efforts so that they see the importance and the value and buy-in. Involving the employees and making sure that knowledge is up to date and accurate.
And Allison, do you mind if I just jump in here for a second?
Not at all.
So I was just thinking, as we were talking about capture and retention, there can be a little bit of confusion because there is quite a bit of overlap, and these are not completely mutually exclusive. And I think, when I talked about codifying information, codifying knowledge, it's important to kind of set up that's really about setting up the framework. So saying, okay, this is, like I mentioned, the key terms, or here's how we're going to set up our file system, and here's our naming structure for our files, and that way that information is easily accessible. And that does, of course, relate to also how searchable, and that's the retention piece that Allison's talking about. So again, accessibility and making it searchable and being able to hold on to it and making sure there's like longevity in the knowledge management, in the systems that support knowledge management is really what Allison's talking about, retention. But certainly, if you don't set up that framework to help codify the knowledge, then it sort of it then creates a problem in terms of retaining as well. So all of these pieces really need to fit together. And I just wanted to bring that up, that there is an intentional overlap there. So.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Setting up yourself for success across these strategies. They're not used in isolation either. A lot of these will be used together to create a more robust knowledge management system. So moving on to our last topic here is the knowledge transfer. And this is just making sure that knowledge is shared across employees. So it's intentional communication and making sure that knowledge is shared in a way that it can reach all employees and span the organization, not just within departments, not within certain teams, but across all employees. And this is an important aspect of knowledge management because it makes that there are multiple people within the transit agency that have the needed knowledge. So if you have one person retiring, that knowledge, again, like we talked about, isn't leaving. It's shared. People can share their personal insights, their lessons learned with others. And this isn't only focusing on sharing knowledge, but also making sure that when knowledge is shared, employees are able to use it. So it needs to go beyond having someone give a lecture about what they know. It needs to move into interaction and making sure that that knowledge is understood and comprehended so that it can actually be used. And when we think about challenges that we can encounter when focusing on knowledge sharing, one of them is knowledge hoarding and a lack of commitment to communication, which I feel like we've covered a lot today already. We want to make sure that employees understand once you get their knowledge, they're not getting kicked to the curb. They're still important, but sharing that knowledge can benefit everyone. We also see some intergenerational differences in knowledge sharing. So sometimes baby boomers may have a hard time communicating or sharing knowledge in a way that younger generations might understand. So we see those different intergenerational differences. You need to make sure that there are ways that all employees can share knowledge and collaborate with one another. Another challenge that we see, and we especially see this when we're sharing across the different types of departments or maybe different organizations, is that people have different mental models or a different language that they use to talk about things. And we don't mean language, English, Spanish, German. We mean, the technical words that you use or the way that you talk about concepts. So just making sure that employees, when they're sharing knowledge, can understand one another and it's presented in a way, again, that can be used and understood is really important for knowledge transfer. So when we talk about knowledge transfer, we have 3 separate action plans to focus on making sure that that knowledge transfer can occur. So the first one is implementing cross-functional team building to promote knowledge sharing. And this is bringing together people from different functions, different departments to share their knowledge with one another. So it promotes an understanding of what other functions do within the transit agency, and it promotes the integration of information across functions. So make sure that people can work together. And this can be accomplished in a lot of different ways. For example, you could have shared training sessions in which all of your employees participate together. It could be brown bag sessions. So maybe you have a brown bag once a month, and the first week you have your maintenance employees talk about what they do or what their work looks like, or a day in the life of a maintenance worker. And you could have an emergency response person talk the next month talking about what they do and what their work looks like. You could do things like job shadowing, having employees watch others within the organization in their daily work. The goal here, again, is just to make sure that there's some knowledge sharing across functions, not just in the silos that can exist. So the value here is that it creates a broader understanding for the employees, a broader perspective of what the work of the transit agency is. And again, it can help to break down those silos that can exist and impede successful performance of the transit agency. The next action plan is to implement knowledge sharing forums and communities of practice. And these are 2 different things that kind of serve the same purpose. So I'll talk about them a little bit separately. But knowledge sharing forums are interactive meetings to share specific knowledge or to facilitate learning about a specific subject. So it might be a one-time session, or maybe you're meeting a couple of times in a week to share some specific knowledge. But it's really just an interactive way to get a set amount of information out to employees and help them learn from one another. Communities of practice, on the other hand, or COPs, in the slide you'll see that here, but communities of practice are more in-depth, and they involve regular meetings to focus on reciprocal knowledge sharing among employees. So with a community of practice, you would bring together employees who have a common shared interest, and they would learn from each other and teach one another about what that looks like in the transit agency, or share the knowledge that they have. And there are action plan steps laid out for both of these in the guidebook. I just wanted to point out that those are 2 different ways of knowledge sharing, but they're kind of similar, so they're presented together here because it's really that interactive learning that's important. And again, the value is that they help to overcome the challenge of transferring knowledge from higher level employees to mid-level or entry-level employees. They also facilitate relationship building, and when you have those relationships, people are more willing to share their knowledge with one another. And then the third strategy here is to coordinate mentoring opportunities to support knowledge management. We know that a lot of transit agencies have mentoring programs in place, but a lot of times those are informal, or a junior level employee may seek out guidance from a senior leader. But the goal here is to really formalize those mentoring opportunities to make sure that they're supporting knowledge management and knowledge transfer across employees. So as many people I'm sure know, mentoring programs involve pairing junior employees with more experienced employees, and they provide an opportunity to share that tacit knowledge that Candace talked about, that know-how, not the step-by-step processes that happen, but really why things need to happen, or how the senior employee has been successful in their job. They can also support retention of junior level employees because employees will feel engaged in the organization when they're learning that and they're involved in those relationships that they've developed. So we have, again, just a couple of examples here for you. So for the implementing cross-functional team building to promote knowledge sharing, we heard from a small transit agency. They have their operational employees cross-trained to make sure that work can move forward even if those employees are unavailable. So making sure that more than one person has the necessary knowledge to business function. A mid-sized bus agency talked about having multiple types of employees complete their emergency response training so that there's always someone who can take on those responsibilities if needed. So you can see this is focusing on more than just one type of employee having needed knowledge. For the next one, implementing knowledge sharing forums and communities of practice, NASA uses master forums to bring together their employees, contractors, and retirees. So they bring together people who may not interact otherwise to talk about what has been successful or where have they failed and how can they learn from one another to make the agency a success. We also heard from Grant Thornton, one of the non-transit industry organizations we talked to, that they talked about having online knowledge sharing forums. So they have an intranet and they encourage people to interact with one another. So they have, blog type posts that people can write, and they want employees to read those and interact with one another and build relationships on the different topics that employees are posting about. So it could be many different things, but they find a way to facilitate those relationships. And then mentoring opportunities. Again, this is one that I'm sure many of you have seen, but these are just some different ways that we've seen transit agencies or other organizations implement them. So, having a 6-month-long program to help employees become leaders, move up the leadership ladder, and just making sure that employees have the knowledge needed for when the senior level employees retire. And then this is moving into what is the last chapter of the guidebook. And I mentioned this earlier, but it's implementing knowledge management from strategies to a function. So how can you as a transit agency move from thinking about one or two of these strategies that we've described into creating that as a function within the organization, having an agency-wide focus on knowledge management and making that successful? So like I said, this is the last chapter in the guidebook, and what we've provided here is just so you can see a snapshot of what's presented. This table just shows all of the different steps that we have laid out to help you bring knowledge management as a full function. So things like identifying your business problems. That's where you start. You say, why do we need knowledge management? How will it benefit us as an agency? All the way through mapping out that plan and eventually measuring the impact of whatever you have implemented. And the goal of this chapter is to really show you that there's no one-size solution for implementing knowledge management. What you do is going to depend on your organization specifically, the practices you already have in place. But this chapter can help any organization kind of walk through those steps of what you need and how to implement knowledge management across the agency. Look at that bigger picture and not just focus on single strategies. And then the last thing that we're going to talk about here is it's actually the appendix to the report, the appendix to the guidebook, but it's the Knowledge Management Technology Tools and Resources Catalog. So this is provided as the appendix to the guidebook, and it includes different tools and resources that you can use to help with learning about knowledge management and implementing it within your own organizations. So the great thing about this is that many of these resources provide much more detail than we've provided today or that could be provided in a single action plan. So they're the types of resources that could be especially useful to you in bringing knowledge management to your agency or learning more about it as you become an expert in the area of knowledge management. So the first part of the appendix has a catalog that includes off-the-shelf technology tools that can be used to support knowledge management experts. So for each of the tools included, we provide you with information that can help you to evaluate the tool and figure out what might be best for your needs and your knowledge management purposes. So in this appendix, there's a description of the tools. There are also details about how that tool fits into KM, the different features of the tool, such as if it supports collaboration or if there's mobile accessibility of that technology. We talk about the costs associated with using the tool and any limitations with the system. So it could be that, there are a limited number of users or limited storage. But all of that information is laid out so that you can figure out what might work best for you in terms of technology to support knowledge management. So on the next slide, we have all of the tools that are included in this part of the appendix. So these are a list of those technology tools, and they can help with the different functions within knowledge management that we've talked about. So for example, Bloomfire can be used to post and store information, whereas Slack or Yammer can facilitate conversations and knowledge sharing among employees. So they're laid out in this way so you can see the different purpose that the technology tools can provide. And one caveat we wanted to share here is that, we present these tools. These are what was available at the time the report and the project was conducted. But there are always new tools. We all know how fast technology moves and how often new programs can be brought to the market. So these tools can really just be a starting place so you can see what's available. But you can also use the resources that are here and the types of questions that are asked about each of the tools to evaluate any other tools that may become available. And see, what might be most useful for your agency. Following those technology tools, we also have non-technology resources provided in that appendix to help you learn more about knowledge management or how to implement it. So the first section includes templates and guides, and these are just what that sounds like. They're different templates that can be used to plan and to implement knowledge management strategies. So they can provide the how-to or the step-by-step guidance that may be helpful in implementing KM. So for example, there's a link to the California Department of Transportation's Knowledge Transfer Guidebook that talks about how they facilitate knowledge transfer. Or there's a succession planning template from the state of Washington. These are the documents that different organizations have used to successfully implement knowledge management strategies and give a resource to you as you do the same. The next section includes a listing of scientific journals that provide periodic articles around knowledge management research. So for example, one of the journals is the Electronic Journal of Knowledge Management, and that's listed there. And not just this list of journals can be a resource to you to help find the most up-to-date new knowledge about or new information about knowledge management. So I mentioned the Electronic Journal of Knowledge Management. Their most recent issue talks about the things that we've talked about today. They talk about building trust to increase knowledge sharing. So those important topics in knowledge management are covered in these journals.
Allison, I would just say that those journals can also help with building a business case that we talked about earlier. So we're trying to get that top-level support, finding those kind of the science that helps support why this is valuable is really helpful to do so.
Absolutely, yeah. Next on the slide, you'll see that we provide various online trainings and certification programs that can be used to increase your knowledge and understanding of these different topics. So some of the training opportunities are free, others have a cost associated with them, but those are listed in the appendix, so you can see just some existing places that can help you learn more and become an expert in the area of knowledge management. And then finally in the catalog in the appendix, we have a list of different conferences that occur that are held usually annually and focus on these different knowledge management topics. So for example, if you have a staff member who will be leading new knowledge management efforts, it might be beneficial to have them attend the International Conference on Knowledge Management that will be held in Vancouver this November. So you can see what those different conferences are and where people will be talking about what's going on in knowledge management and the new best practices and science behind it. And then we just wanted to wrap up the webinar with some of the different lessons learned from talking to transit agencies about knowledge management and some of the big takeaways that we'd like you to have from this. First, we wanted to make sure that the strategies in the guidebook would resonate with transit agencies and be strategies that they could actually implement and could really make a difference for your organizations. So this included making sure that transit agencies of different sizes or in different areas with different operating structures would all be able to see these strategies and understand how they could fit into the work that you're doing. So that's why we have those different case studies for different size agencies. And we really try to present how you can use knowledge management throughout the guidebook. A big lesson learned and something to consider to really bring maximum benefit to your organization is that knowledge management doesn't have to exist in a single entity. So creating knowledge networks across transit agencies could provide benefits through sharing and building on ideas of others. So most of you would work within the same regulations or have similar problems to transit agencies around you or of the same type. So working together and sharing knowledge can be beneficial. It doesn't have to be just within your agency, or even sharing within an agency can be beneficial across the silos like we've talked about. Another key takeaway that we really want to emphasize is that most likely you can build on things that you're already doing to improve the knowledge management in your transit agency. So for example, one of the strategies that I talked about was the standard operating procedures to retain knowledge. You likely already have those standard operating procedures in place, but making sure that they're accurate and up to date with all the needed knowledge is important. Also, making that knowledge capture and sharing part of the organizational culture, like Candace has talked about. But things that you're already doing can be built upon and brought together to form a robust knowledge management program within your organization. Making sure that it's something everyone can participate in and making it administratively easy to use is going to help with bringing the strategies to life and being successful. One of the biggest challenges we see across industries, as we've talked about today, is that people are really afraid that they're going to be replaced if they give someone else their knowledge. We hear knowledge is power. So you really need to focus on building that culture where transparency and sharing are valued and important, making it something integral to your organization. Creating a culture of knowledge sharing, knowledge management. This is what we do. We share ideas, and it makes us all successful. And then, so the entire guidebook and the catalog that we described today are available on the TRB website, and there's much more information and more detail on everything that we talked about. So for example, we mentioned there are detailed action plans for each of those strategies that Candace and I described. And then that last chapter, like I said, has that guidance on how to bring knowledge management to your organization as an overall function rather than just isolated strategies that don't work together. And we really hope that this guidebook is something that's useful to you as you work to increase your knowledge management within your organizations, and that this information can really get you headed in the right path and in the direction to sharing and capturing, sharing, and storing all of that knowledge that's important. And that is, I don't know if Candace, you have anything else to add as a wrap-up? Otherwise, we can move into any questions that came up.
Yeah, I know we have a few minutes for Q&A. I would just say one thing that's interesting that's come up since this report was published. I've been working with the airport industry, and I was at a Thought Leaders Forum, and a few of the different airports were talking about this idea of generational mentoring. So I would just kind of point that out as something. We talked about kind of the generational differences as a potential obstacle to KM, and I think that's one thing we hear quite a bit about. And I think what's important is to, instead of focusing on all the challenges, I mean, certainly we should identify challenges, but focusing on the strengths that the different generational perspectives bring. So for example, you have fresh new insights paired with historical tried that before insights, right? And so I think a lot of times they're partnering individuals that maybe are IT savvy with somebody who's much, maybe has the savvy about building relationships and networks across the industry. So again, I think generational mentoring is a key tool that I'm hearing about in other industries, and also I would just, we talked a little bit about this, I think it was mentioned once, but just the whole idea of collaborating across transit agencies. So I think knowledge management doesn't have to be just something that happens within your agency, but also can span transit agencies and help to, again, identify what practices are going on within other agencies. We've even seen this within transit, like, and going back to the mentoring piece too. Sorry, this is kind of a third point, but that transit agencies will partner, for example, new bus operators with seasoned operators so that they get that experience. And again, like you said, Allison, that investment is important. But I think in terms of cross agencies, there may even be opportunities to send some of your employees to other programs that other agencies are offering so that they can learn from those. And I know there's some competition that happens in terms of recruitment, but I also think it's important to look at knowledge management more globally. So those are some last points I had. But and there's a couple questions. It looks like one just popped up. Lori, do you want us to address? I've addressed most of them in the chat.
Yes, I just wanted to remind everyone, if they have any questions, to please type it into the chat box, and one of us will read it aloud. I noticed that during, Candace, you had answered all of the questions that came in, so I don't know that we need to go over those. Everybody can just scroll up and read them, and I usually do save in a text file the chats from the webinars. If somebody wants to refer to it, you can shoot me an email. But the latest question that came in is from Sarah Farkas, and she asks, can you say how knowledge management fits into more general workforce planning?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So there's sort of, I think of workforce development, which is broader, which is like recruitment, retention, training and development, the overall building capacity of your workforce. And then when we talk about workforce planning, we're talking about kind of staffing analysis and figuring out, how many staff you need to perform a particular function. And so those things are certainly related. So I'm just going to answer the question with that in mind, but I don't know, Sarah, if you mean just kind of the broader workforce development angle, or if you're specifically focusing on kind of the staffing analysis and planning and planning for the future demands. But I would say really it fits into both strategies and both pieces, both workforce development, growing your workforce. Like I said, the more knowledge that's shared and openly across the organization, the more you build that professional capacity and you help equip your workforce to be able to kind of step in for one another if someone's out. And also be able to identify where to go for information and build efficiencies that way. And then I think in terms of workforce planning, we'll be able to better estimate, in terms of our staffing, what we need once we understand what it is, what knowledge we currently have and where the gaps exist. So again, I think if we looked at workforce planning as more than just the number of hours that need to be, the number of, the workload relative to the number of hours that it takes to perform that workload, and we also looked at kind of the bigger picture of what knowledge is needed to perform those different tasks, and I think it certainly informs how we go about doing our staffing and workload analysis. So I don't know if I know that's kind of a quick answer there, but I could certainly speak to you in more detail about that.
It looks like Sarah said thank you, so I guess you completely answered the question.
Okay, great.
Yes, she has confirmed that. It looks like other people are typing, but sometimes they are chatting with each other, and it's hard to tell, excuse me, whether I should wait for another question. So anyone, if you have a question, you have Candace and Allison's email addresses. You can always, I'm sure they wouldn't mind answering your questions. Oh, there's from Larry Delgado. Where would you recommend the KM officer/office be located?
So I don't know if you mean physically located, which I presume, that would be headquarters, right? And there's probably really only one office. But I think you're talking about in terms of the organizational structure. And I would say, I mentioned this earlier, and I think what we're seeing is that really, like you look at NASA, the State Department, some of those larger agencies that have been really effective in terms of CAM, and they really have a chief knowledge management officer that's really within the executive group and perhaps reports directly to the COO or the CEO. So I think that is a really important place, because then where you position somebody within the organization, the lead, communicates a lot about the value of that. So if you're saying KM is integral to us, we need to be sharing knowledge, we need to make sure that we're retaining it, and then we're not operating in these silos or hoarding knowledge, and that we're prepared for the future, then you're going to designate somebody to be within that executive suite and report to the very top. So again, that would be probably the ideal recommendation. Sometimes we have smaller agencies don't have the resources to have one KM officer, and so it has to be kind of a shared function. But again, I would still share that function across people that are highly influential and have, you know, a leadership position within the organization and are well respected so that it communicates the value.
Larry said thank you. Anybody else? I know there's sort of this silent lag while we're waiting for the questions to come in, but it looks like a couple more people are typing, so we'll wait another few seconds. See if anything comes in. I feel like I should play the Jeopardy theme or something.
Well, and I just want to say while we're here, please feel free to write down our email addresses, reach out to us. We're happy to follow up and have a dialogue with you. Reach out to either myself, Candace, or to Allison. We really enjoyed this work, and I think picking up that guidebook and just flipping through it, it's very user-friendly, as I mentioned. Let's see.
Okay, so it's from Rodaliza. I hope I'm not mispronouncing. Have you seen more mid-sized agencies implementing this, and how long usually is the initiation phase?
To be quite honest, we did not see a lot of transit agencies implementing this on a comprehensive level, but we would see specific initiatives going on. And Allison, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think, so for example, creating a repository system or creating a way that we're going to document our standard operating procedures, or they might have a particular mentoring program that they're using for the purpose of encouraging knowledge sharing. So again, haven't seen a lot of transit system. I think this is why this project happened, because there's a big need and a big gap in transit for this. I have been hearing about it in the airports area and certainly in other transportation areas. And then I mentioned some of the other public sector types of organizations doing this, but not common. But I think it's definitely a need.
Great. Oh, and I'm glad I pronounced your name correctly. She said thank you.
I was just going to add, in terms of time, a lot of it will really depend on the strategies that your agency needs. You know, so some may be able to be implemented and developed in, you know, a month or two. Others may take, you know, 6 months or a year to really bring that strategy into full force. So even if you're implementing knowledge management, you know, as a whole overarching, you know, new division or something like that, the specific strategies that you're focusing on will really determine how long it takes to bring it to fruition.
All right. I think we're going to do a last call for questions. I'm noticing the participants are starting to drop out at the hour-and-a-half mark, which is what we allotted. So going once, going twice. Okay, Candace, Allison, any parting words before I wrap this up?
No, thank you for listening. I would just say again, please look at the guidebook, because there were a lot of practical nuggets and some really rich, detailed information that we couldn't get into today. So again, we just wanted to give you a high-level overview of what's in there, and then we're hoping that that'll encourage you to go look at it. And I think Allison's exactly right that I think we even have some information about timelines and you know, specifics on how to. That's what the action plans do, is outline specifics on how to implement different strategies. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, and I want to thank everyone, the speakers, the participants, everyone for participating in this webinar. A special thank you to Candace and Allison for your very informative presentation. People seem to have enjoyed it. The immediate feedback in the chat box is very good. Everyone's saying thank you. As a reminder to everyone, you will be receiving an invitation to fill out an evaluation. You'll get it in your email. NTI really appreciates your feedback, so if you could just take a couple minutes and fill that out, we would be very appreciative. Other than that, hope everybody has a great Tuesday afternoon. Thanks.